It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all. My name is Prima. I work with the Arshia Society. And on behalf of Avid Learning, the Opera House, and the Mumbai International Literary Festival, we welcome you to the launch of Mr. Gurcharan Das's new book, Kama, the Riddle of Desire. I would now like to invite the founder-director of Tata Lit Live to please come and introduce the speakers, Mr. Anil Dharkar.
Hello, everyone. Can't see anyone, but it is a full house. Good. This is a very special occasion because we've got three cultural bodies coming together for one event. We've got Arshia Society, we've got Avid Learning, and Literature Live. And of course, at this place, which is the Royal Opera House. It's still called the Royal Opera House, by the way, like the Royal Yacht Club. Someone asked me the other day that you're doing an event with Avid, and someone else once asked me, doing an event with the Arshia Society, but they are rivals. And I said, they're not rivals, we are collaborators. Because what are we fighting? We are fighting, but we're fighting together. We're fighting a battle which sometimes you feel is a losing battle, but it's a battle for culture. It's a battle for culture in a country which very often gives you the impression that it is against culture. Culture in various forms. Now there are lots of institutions which are doing this. There's Jnana Prabha, the Saryu and Vinod Doshi Foundation. I think I saw Saryu there. There's G5A, run by Anuradha Parekh. There's the Godrej Center in Vikhroli. There's NCPA, of course. There's Prince of Wales Museum. Now the unifying theme of all these bodies, and I may have missed a few, is that we're all trying to do in our own way something to encourage either interest in artifacts, in antiquities, in literature, in the performing arts, the whole lot of it. The other factor common to all these bodies I've mentioned is that none of them have government funding at all. I think that's significant. We all work on our own. Almost everyone has free entry, like all of you have come today. And it's through the kindness of strangers who are sponsors who make it possible. I won't take too much of your time. We've got a stellar cast here. But I do want to tell you that the Mumbai International Literary Festival is on from November 15th to 18th. And I think many of you are regulars. This is our 9th. So we are on at NCPA. Then 3 years ago, we added Prithvi. And I'm really happy to announce that this year we are adding a third venue, which is in Bandra, the Tidal Wave Bookshop. So free entry, no passes. So all of you are welcome. Block your diaries. Now here we are for the launch of Kama, the Riddle of Desire, written by my friend Gurcharan Das. In my covering letter, I described him as a true Renaissance man, which he truly is. He has a philosophy degree from Harvard. Then he strayed away and became a CEO of Procter & Gamble. He has written a novel, a play, lots of non-fiction. When I think of people like him and achievers like him, I wonder, do they ever sleep? But because they produce so much and so much that's good. With him today in conversation is Amrita Narayanan, who's a psychoanalytic psychotherapist practicing in Goa, but she also does a lot of writing in academic journals, popular periodicals. Her latest book is an anthology, The Parrots of Desire, 3,000 Years of Erotica in India. And there's Arshia Sattar, an old friend who's taken part in our festival many times. She has a PhD in the University of Chicago from the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations. And if you haven't seen her translation of Valmiki's Ramayana, you should try and get a copy. Her latest book is Lost Loves, Exploring Rama's Anguish. So let me invite on the stage Gurcharan Das, Arshia Sattar, and Amrita Narayanan.
You know, I think we need a little more light in the audience, because at least I like to look at the eyes. Ah, perfect. I look at the eyes of the people I'm talking to. You do me honor by coming to the launch of my new book, and I have the great fortune to be amongst two very outstanding individuals who I deeply admire, and I don't need to reintroduce them because Anil has just done so. You know, we all want to live a meaningful, happy life. And I always had a one-line definition of happiness, which was to love the work you do and love the person you live with. Until I discovered the ancient Purusharthas that actually have led to a trilogy of books. And I write books because it's a form of self-cultivation, or really problems that trouble you. And if you're an Indian, you have to be troubled by poverty. And so I wrote India Unbound, which was about how a poor country could become rich. And it was one of the first books that predicted the rise of India. And I'm happy to say that India obliged by rising. Then the second thing that bothered me was that while India was rising, we had a hell of a lot of corruption. And so I thought about the moral dimension of life, and I wrote a book called The Difficulty of Being Good, which was about dharma. So the first one was artha, material well-being, dharma, moral well-being. And what has probably troubled me the most is the third Purushartha, which is kama. And kama means both desire and pleasure. And and so it's really a sort of a trilogy which was not designed as such, but it seems to have worked out that way. And by the end of this discussion, I hope we, the three of us, can persuade you that really when there's a balance of these, which was the famous classical balance of the Gupta period, that when they are in balance, then life is in harmony and one is happy. So let me just let me narrate two incidents from this book, which will give you a quick flavor. Now, I quickly realized that you can't write about desire in the abstract. You have to create a story. So I've created a fictional memoir, and the narrator's name is Amar. His voice is a bit like me, so please, it's not me, it's Amar. And he is an older man who is looking back at his life, and he says, my first memory of desire was when I was 4 years old. It was cold in the morning. I woke up at dawn and I felt lonely. And so I rushed to my mother's bed. I nestled beside her and fell blissfully asleep. And then the narrator stops the story and he says, well, desire strikes early in life, but it can also strike early in a civilization. Unlike the Judeo-Christian tradition, where in the beginning was light, God said, let there be light in Genesis, in the Rig Veda, in the beginning was desire, and the cosmos was created from the seed of desire in the mind of the One. It's a very different way to think about desire, and the question I ask, the narrator asks, Amar asks, what does it say about a civilization where in the beginning was desire? And India, classical India, is the only civilization that raised desire to a goal of life. These ancients realized that if you did not have desire, you wouldn't have any action, you wouldn't wake up in the morning. It is the source of creation and it's the source of procreation. And they, in fact, created a god called Kama in honor of this goal of life. And let me just, now that I'm at it, so this is the cover of the book. And these are 5 flowers on the cover. And these are the 5 arrows that Kama strikes at his victims. And so the white lotus is the flower. When the two people meet, there's fascination. The red Ashoka, flower of the Ashoka tree, is the one when they decide to do something about it. The jasmine flower is the 3rd stage when there's intimacy. And this intimacy can be a love affair, it can be marriage, it can produce children, and after 20 years of raising children, and you know what that means, the fact is that you reach the 4th stage of desire, which is the blue lotus, when desire wanes in life. And so the challenge, and of course the last one is when desire dies, and so you can get a divorce or whatever, but that's the sandalwood flower. And these 5 stages of life, 5 stages of desire, play an important part in my story. But the part that I mentioned earlier about the child feeling lonely, I'm convinced after this book that the great pleasure of sex is partly to compensate us for the loneliness of the human condition. Not only that, but the human infant is the most infuriatingly difficult infant to bring up for all the species. So it is also a compensation for the hard work of bringing up children. Anyway, the second incident that I want to describe is when the narrator is in his 40s. He's been married for 20 years, and he goes into work one day, and clearly desire has waned in his life, and he feels very sad about it. But he still loves his family, he loves his wife, he loves his children, and he thinks, is this what life was all about? A week later, he has to go to Pune. So he takes the Deccan Queen from VT. By the way, I'm a Bombay boy, so I know all about the stations of Bombay. And by the way, a large part of this book is set in Bombay. So that's another reason to buy it. On the Deccan, as they are about to leave, in walks in a beautiful woman. And she sits down near Amar. And they begin to chat. And clearly, very quickly, there is some chemistry. They're both attracted to each other. Their conversation soon becomes quite intimate. And by the end of the journey, it is quite clear that they may have an affair. And at the thought of that, Amar is at first terrified. And as he thinks, should he or should he not have an affair, this is what goes through his mind. If he has the affair, his marriage will be broken. The person he loves the most will be hurt. It will be devastating for the family, the children. Should he not have the affair because of the children? But then he says, well, the children are going to grow up and go away. These wretched kids. And then he says, maybe, but if I ignore the children, they'll never forget it. So maybe he thinks he'll keep the affair a secret. Both of them are married, by the way. So they'll keep it a secret. So what will be the consequence of that? Well, he says that first I'll have to lie, and then lies will have to be piled upon more lies. And soon he would become an inauthentic human being. And what if they are discovered? My God, the horror. I mean, he's well regarded in society. It's scary. And then he thinks maybe he shouldn't have the affair. But then what is the consequence of not having the affair? The consequence of that will be that he will probably resent himself, resent his family for the rest of his life, that he lost one great moment of happiness, and he might end up as a dried up, shriveled old man. And so this, in terms of the Purusharths, is the classic conflict between dharma, duty to another, versus kama, duty to yourself. Should he betray his wife or should he betray himself? That is a classic conflict. And the Kama Sutra has very interesting advice on this. The Kama Sutra says that when a woman sees an attractive man, she's attracted to him, handsome man. When a man sees a beautiful woman, he's attracted to her. But then the matter goes no further. That is the Kama Sutra talking, believe it or not. Kama Sutra, by the way, is not a book of sexual positions. It's a book of manners. It advises you, it says, don't talk about yourself, talk about her if you want to be successful. Don't speak in Sanskrit, speak in the language of the people, Prakrit, what she speaks. Otherwise, you'll sound like a show-off. And the best advice the Kama Sutra gives is, if you are kissed, kiss back. Anyway, so I'm just giving you sort of a flavor of this book, and it's the thing that you notice here is that we were a very open culture, and which produced the Kama Sutra, and we had what I call Kama optimists, which there was great Sanskrit love poetry, there was the temples at Khajuraho, the Kama Sutra, and the courtly life was a very erotic life. And so we elevated Kama to a goal of life. But we are wrong in believing that it is the Victorians who made us prudish. The fact is, from the beginning, pretty much from the beginning, from the Upanishads, we also began to have our Kama pessimists. And the Kama pessimists are the yogis, the rishis, the Buddha, the Jains, for whom Kama was an obstacle to their spiritual project. And they believed in celibacy. So in this conflict between the Kama optimists and the Kama pessimists, we have a compromise. And that is the grand compromise, which is basically that sex is all right as long as it's within marriage. And it happens in every society. And I just wanted to illustrate very quickly, and then I think we'll start our discussion, that the openness with which we talked about our emotional life. You know, today we are very happy to talk about our economic lives, our political lives, but when it comes to our emotional lives, we brush it under the carpet. And this is why I'm so glad this Me Too movement is a kind of liberation. When we are talking about our emotional, our sexual lives. And I just wanted to say that in the Mahabharata, there are wonderful stories, but I'll just tell you one, which shows you this openness of our culture. Yudhishthir asks Bhishma at one point, who enjoys sex more, a man or a woman? And Bhishma says, well, you've got to be both a man and a woman to know that, answer that question. And then he remembers that there was once King Bhangashvana, who lived half his life as a man, and then he became a woman. And he was a good person, and so at the end of his life, he is asked, now you have the choice. what would you like to be born as in your next life? And he says, a woman. And people say, are you crazy? You could be the emperor of the earth if you were a man. He says, no. What I have learned in being a woman is that the emotional life is far richer than the public life. This is what E.M. Forster was also talking about when he wrote Two Cheers for Democracy. E.M. Forster meant that the private life, the life of the emotions. And he also said that a woman enjoys sex far more than a man. And so I'll close my introduction on that fine note. And Arshia, you take us through a discussion. And Amrita, you.
Thank you, Gurcharan. I'm really glad you remember that the story ends with him saying that women actually have more pleasure having sex. I was thinking all this stuff about, like, you know, the public life and the emotional life. But no, the story is about women having sex and having fun having sex. I wanted actually to start with what you said about the Me Too movement, which is certainly dominating our public discourse, and rightly so. Karma, and this is a question for both of you actually, karma as an idea assumes the mutuality of desire. And what we are learning more and more, because people are reminding us of it, is that desire is not always mutual. And this idea that, you know, the Kama Sutra says, or somebody kisses you, kiss back. Or what if you don't like the guy or the woman? Or, you know, you don't want to be kissed, yes? So I wanted you both to respond to the idea of that desire is always mutual.
Well, just very quickly, and then you take over, Amrita. The Kama Sutra also says that first, remember, if you want to be a successful seducer, you first give her pleasure first, and then think of your own pleasure. So it is actually hinting at the notion of mutuality. And there's another story, this is not from the Mahabharata, but which shows you that desire, the point you made, that desire is usually unequal. And the person who desires more is often more vulnerable than the other. In other words, the story is a story of a king. It's often Bhartrihari's story, but it is a king in the 1st century AD who was a good king, and he received a boon that you have this boon of immortality. He loved his queen, and so he gave her the boon. But the queen was in love with a courtier, and so the queen gave the boon to the courtier. But the courtier was actually in love with a sort of a lower level princess, or a maid even, a maid of honor, shall we say. And so he gave the boon to the maid. And the maid was in love with the king. So she presented the boon to the king. And so the king was so disgusted at this inequality of love that you talked about, that he just decided to take one vase and get out of this whole nonsense of it. Now,
Yeah,
Amrita.
maybe your next
The
book should
devil
be
take love.
Yeah.
That's right.
No, your next book should be The Pain of Immortality, instead of like The Pleasures of Moksha. But Amrita, I wanted you to respond to the inequality of desire, the non-mutuality of it.
One of the things I really liked about this book is that I re-understood karma as a form of self-awareness, and a form of self-awareness in which lust exists alongside affection. I always go back to Freud's definition of eros, which is very similar to karma, in which eros is best thought of like a river, and the river has two currents, the one of lust that seeks to be gratified, and the one of affection that looks out for the other person and notices if they want to be gratified in the same way. In Tamil we have kadal and anbu, and they go side by side. You have the desire as well as the lustful desire as well as the affectionate, protective stream. And I think there's been a gendering there, where women are considered to be all affection and men are considered to be all lust. But as we know, you talk about a lot in the book, between evolutionary studies and the sexual revolution, we know that both genders have equal lust. It is just that one gender has cultivated affection a little bit more than the other. And this society has been constructed for the cultivation of maternal affection and female affection. So I think that's one of the very central problems.
And when we talk about the Me Too, just to come back to the Me Too movement, I have a column coming in the Times in a few days about this. But one of the things that strikes me is that we are living in historic times. That, the way I see the history of India, we got our independence in 1947. But it was not it was only our political independence. We got our economic independence in 1991. But 2018, when you see all the Supreme Court judgments that have come in the last few months, the fantastic privacy law, the decriminalization of homosexuality, the decriminalization of adultery, triple talaq, the entry of women into temples, these all, and the Me Too movement above all. And this Me Too movement is happening, by the way, at a time when globalization is at its worst, because Trump is an enemy of globalization, and Brexit, of course, Brexit is an enemy of globalization. I mean, globalization doesn't get good press right now, but we have a globalization of ideas. This Me Too movement has caught fire around the world. I heard the other day that in Kazakhstan, they have a Me Too movement as well. And in India, it's not going to stop. So the whole business of consent, the whole business of inequality, all these issues, I think, so I regard 2018 as a historic moment in, shall we call it emotional liberation, sexual liberation, whatever
you
will.
are a karma optimist entirely, and it makes me feel a little bit better about some of the horrible things we've been hearing over the last month. I wanted also to talk about karma, the sort of deification of karma, and there are two things that I wanted to mention, again for both of you, but Gurcharan first. Karma is also called Ananga, right? Bodiless. He becomes bodiless, yes, because Shiva burns him up.
Right.
So that, to me, I've always found very interesting, that how can the god of desire, how can the seat of desire, the physical seat of desire, be eliminated and still be the god of love? That's the one thing I wanted you both to talk about. And then, of course, your very, very beautiful idea, a reminder that karma is also called smara.
That's right.
memory, and how love and memory have to go together. You cannot have love really without memory.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that happens to people who suffer from dementia and Alzheimer's. They've forgotten that they love this person, and there's nothing to build that love on. So, yeah.
You know, I believe that smara, which is this wonderful Sanskrit word, kama can be love of anything, even love of God and love of money and all that. But smara is sexual love. And it's a memory of love. And I have come to the conclusion, like Proust, that actually the memory of love is more powerful than the event of love. In other words, that when you are actually when you are in love, and you are, whether you're making love or you're together in a date or whatever, too much is going on, around you. You don't have time to really savor. But in memory, you select, and you select those memories. And then you build those memories. And so actually, the memory of an event is superior to the event itself. And this is not just love, but of many things. But I wanted to talk about the God of love and why he is bodiless. Well, first of all, I would like to make a proposal to all of you. I mean, just like we have a Me Too movement, we need to start a Me Too movement here today in the Royal Opera House, which is to change Valentine's Day to Kama Deva Divas. And we will take the wind out of the sails of the Hindutvas if we do that. No more Romeo squads and all that. We will all be children of a God. Now, this God, there's a whole story about why he's burnt by Shiva, because Shiva was meditating and Parvati wanted Kama through I think it was this flower that he threw at him, and he woke up and he got very angry after his 1,000 years of merit suddenly went down. But there's a wonderful, the reason why he's bodiless is, I think, to remind us that actually desire, we think it's in the heart, but actually it's in the mind. So, ananga, you are the Sanskritist. So, and there's a wonderful story in the Mahabharata about a rishi who has a pupil named Vipul, and he has a beautiful wife, Ruchi. And Indra, who is a philanderer, we know, the king of gods, is in love with Ruchi. And he's been watching a moment when he can go after Ruchi. And so the rishi tells Vipul, son, I'm going away for work. You look after my wife. And so Indra sees him going away, and he transforms himself into the most beautiful prince in the world and arrives before Ruchi and follows all the steps that the Kama Sutra teaches you on how to seduce. And Vipul realizes that Ruchi is getting very attracted to this handsome prince. And so Vipul knows that Kama is in the mind. So he goes inside her mind and he controls Ruchi's mind. And when he controls Ruchi's mind, of course, Indra can't succeed, and he goes away disappointed, and Ruchi has been saved. And then, of course, the rishi comes back and thanks Vipul and all. But Vipul feels very
dirty, actually.
Yeah, he feels ashamed. He feels that, you know, he feels that actually by entering Ruchi's mind, he has done an act which is far more intimate than even entering her body. And therefore, he, Vipul, is guilty of betraying his master. And so this is another story about how it's in the mind and why karma is ananga, is why bodiless.
Well, I wonder if we might usefully relate it back to Me Too. And when we consider somebody who perpetrates their lust upon someone without considering their mind at all, nor reflecting upon what's in their own mind, might it be useful to rethink about karma as I was saying earlier, a form of self-awareness, a way of mental functioning, and indeed a poverty of imagination when it is only bodily lust and not including a mental component to it.
I'm always very struck by the story of Ahalya, the way it is in the Ramayana that, you know, Indra, our favorite philanderer, when Gautama, her husband, is away, he approaches her in the form of Gautama. But, you know, Ahalya knows that it's Indra, and she's like, oh, well, this is the king of the gods, you know, I'm going to sleep with him. And of course, Gautama comes back and finds them in delecto flagrante, and curses Ahalya to become bodiless. In Ramayana, she becomes bodiless, and in other stories, she becomes a stone. And I've always thought, wow, what a punishment for physical desire, that the seat of your pleasure is utterly destroyed.
Yeah.
And there's this constant push-pull within later Hinduism about the goodness or the badness of desire. You know, this very, very tormented relationship, whether it comes from the Upanishads or from Buddhism, but it's a constant tension, you know, right through, even through Khajuraho and everything.
And in fact, you know, I talked about karma realism, which was a grand compromise. And this compromise of marriage was, of course, stated in the Dharma Shastras. But in the Manava Dharma Shastra, which we know, the Manu Smriti, Manu has a pretty negative view. In fact, only the Buddha Charita has a worse view of, but in fact, not the Buddha Charita, but the Jains actually, I'm sorry if there are Jains here in the audience, but the Jains have really got, you have to read Bridikatha, the great text of the Jains' story about the Brid. Anyway, the point I was trying to make here is that the Manu has this idea that women have an insatiable appetite for sex. And therefore, a woman has to be controlled and protected. And so, she must be protected by her father, her brother, her husband. And then he says, well, you know, we can't control her 24 hours of the day. So we must get her to control herself. So these stories of Ahilya, of Sita, Savitri, all these stories of the sacrificing wife, which Manu is a brainwash, essentially, in his view, for the woman, for women to control themselves. And so there is a bit of karma pessimism in the Manu Smriti also.
When I read through your book, it seems like you think it's a successful brainwash in some ways, because you speak periodically about a woman's vulnerability in love.
Yes, it is. I mean, I think that's partly what this Me Too movement also is reminding us about the vulnerability and the inequality, essentially.
And the nature of it, the nature of that inequality between men and women is not so much about biology, but rather about psychology and about, in a girl's early life, investing in her with a low self-esteem such that her dependence on a man increases. That's the foundation of the Manava Dharma Shastra.
Yeah.
In her youth, she must be made to feel dependent on a man. She must be made to feel like she's less, so that when a man bestows his attention upon her, it feels like everything.
But you know, there was a moment in history, Amrita and Arshia, which is I'm talking about the 12th century, when an amazing thing happened. On 3 continents in the world, romantic love was born, and a woman's status was raised to kind of a pedestal. And in the West, it is exemplified by the story of Tristan and Isolde, but also Heloise and Abelard, and many, many the chivalric tales of the 12th century. In the Islamic world, you have the story of Laila and Majnu in Persian by Nazami. In fact, I was telling you, my one regret is that I had access to Sanskrit because of Ingalls and my studies there, but I never had access to Persian. And I would have put a lot of Persian poetry into this book, but it's already 560 pages. So.
A doorstopper, remember?
She calls it a doorstopper.
Yeah. And Gurcharan was like, I've heard about showstopper. But I said, no, this is a doorstopper. You can stop a door with it. But that it gives the book gravitas to call it that.
So the third, by the way, it's not quite as big as you think, because the font is very big. So actually, when it comes out in paperback, it'll be about half the size. So easier, not so big. But the third continent where the romantic movement begins is in eastern India, Bengal and Orissa, and it is born in one of the greatest texts of our subcontinent, which is called Geet Govinda by Jayadeva. And what is amazing about this text is that it is, you never know, it's love of Radha and Krishna. And by the way, it is recited every night and without fail since the 12th century, every night in the Jagannath temple at Puri. And you don't know whether it's human love or divine love. Normal interpretation of bhakti, which is the direction in which romantic love went in India, Chaitanya and others, in Jayadev's genius is that it is not just the love of the soul, the yearning of the soul for the divine, but it is the love of God, not only for all creatures, which is what it's supposed to be, but it is for one woman. And Radha, and she's married. So it's an adulterous love of a God for a human woman.
There you have it.
There you have
It's
it.
okay.
So what I was just saying is, these are the great moments, like Jayadev's, I think everybody should read that. And I still recommend Barbara Stroller Miller's translation, although there are others. But the other text which I deal with at some length in the marriage chapter is probably the greatest poem in the world about conjugal love. And that is the love of the love making of Shiva and Parvati, who are the parents of us all. And really, frankly, 99% of love poetry is about illicit love. This is that 1% of, of conjugal love. But my God, it is mind-blowing. You know, this is Kalidasa, and it's the birth of Kumara, which is, of course, the story of Shiva and Parvati and all that. But anyway.
Amrita, I want you to respond to this idea that somehow sexual love and romantic love is sublimated and transformed into love for God, and then we can say all the sexy things, but we're saying them about God.
You know, that the question has really preoccupied me in the bhakti poetry. Maybe it's a metaphor, maybe it's not. My question is, why use that metaphor? Why does Mahadevyaka say, I want to smash my pitcher breasts against you? Why doesn't she just say, I wish our souls were joined together? Why does Mirabai say, another night has passed and no one has lifted my gown? Why doesn't she just say, Lord, come, yes, I love you, come into me? Well, she says, come into me, but why does she say it like that? And I think it's because there are probably numerous reasons that these bhakti poets recognize the power that sexuality has for us human beings. Short of the early experiences of childhood, being held and breastfed by the mother, there is no physical experience of life that quite compares to that sexual experience. And I think in order to convey that, the use of the sexuality, but I also wonder whether, did they not experience it that way? May it not feel wonderful in the breasts to greet Krishna entering your room? Probably it would. I could only imagine so.
And of course, it's worldwide. No, it's not just bhakti poems.
Yes.
It's Song of
Sufi.
Songs and fana. You know, the idea of surrender, right? But and also this thing. It is about sublimation, because there's the idea of surrender without the body. You know. Or the sort of dissolution of the body in that moment of final union, which again is some kind of way of really, really talking about orgasm. And, you know, the best sex you can have is the one that in which there is dissolution of the one and the other.
And the greatest poetry about that is really the Sufi poetry, and especially people like Rumi and Shams Tabriz, and I never learned that stuff, but I would have really liked to have.
Oh, but you're a young man, Gurcharan. You can start learning Persian now, and, we'll get it in your next book. Okay, I'm going to have one last question for the both of you, and then I'm going to ask our audience to join the conversation. And this pertains to both of your books. Amrita, your book, Pirates of Desire, in which you anthologize erotic writing from ancient times as well as modern times, yeah? And of course, Gurcharan's book is very, very much about this as well. Is there a difference in the way we talk about desire from, like 2,000 years ago and now? Has the nature of desire, can the nature of desire change as we change?
I don't think the nature of desire can change. But I think there might be a difference, and I think it's a very hopeful difference, which is that there are more voices talking about desire. My hopeful thought, my karma optimism, is that at this particular moment, we have more of a chance to be polyvocal about desire than we ever have. And if you look at the history, certainly in India, you have the Tamil Sangam, you have the Amaru Sataka, you have the Gata Saptasai, but there's silos. Silos, Kama Sutras, the Gupta period is a silo of desire and celebration, and then it's just in one socioeconomic class or one geographic region. There's certainly something about the democratization of sensuality that seems to be in the air at this particular point in history. So in that sense, I would say polyvocal and more democratic. Yeah.
And possibly more women's voices, because
certainly.
Even in our classical texts, when a woman is speaking, it's very often a man writing.
Yeah.
The woman's voice and his idea, his fantasy of female desire.
Right, exactly. And that's why actually I was struck by the fact that in classical Sanskrit poetry, you don't have an expression of male jealousy. In other words,
Because
it's
they're
always a
writing the
woman
poems, yeah.
who is jealous. Why is a man doesn't express? Obviously men were jealous, but why doesn't they express it?
I always thought it was part of conserving the man's narcissistic supplies.
Exactly. It is, well, it is really, but this is what Ingalls also says, that actually it is like confessing that you've been cuckolded. And so this Me Too movement, a lot of it has to do with the way we bring up our boys. You know, in other words, it's male narcissism. That the classical way, I mean, that you're the psychologist, so you know that an Indian bride doesn't really get affirmed until she produces a son. And especially in a joint family in those days, when the mother-in-law ruled the roost, the poor thing, until she produced the son, and so the son, especially the eldest son, was just the center of the universe. And so that's the beginning of this male privilege, male narcissism. And that's really, I mean, you know, you don't like Modi, but I must say one thing, Arshia, that on one of his Independence Day speeches, remember a few years ago, I remember hearing him say, he says, Modi said, you worry about, he's talking to you as parents, and he says, you worry about your daughters when they come home late at night. Why don't you worry about your sons? And this is how, the problem is with you. You haven't taught you haven't brought up your sons properly.
Well, who brings up sons? I think the problem, I agree with you, I'm right there with you, but I think that the fact that healthy female narcissism is inadequate, that's why mothers in the past have not been able to say no to their sons, because even there, the gender difference and this hierarchy of gender is inculcated at such an early age. So I would say the absence of healthy female narcissism is sort of...
I think even the way you construct Amar in the book, you know, the way this is brilliantly masculinist justification for having an affair. It's like, oh, you know, I'm going to grow into a shriveled old man. Yes, darling, you are, whether or not you have the affair. You know, that is the destiny of all our bodies. But I found that very, very charming in a way. That is like, of course he's going to have the affair. He's got so many reasons.
Well, this is a man, Amar is, in the book, is a man who feels inferior if a woman is beautiful as well as intelligent. He can only take one.
And frankly, I confess in the very first page that this book, the author's note, is written from a man's point of
I
view.
thought that was beautifully done.
And that's why I insisted with Anil and Bunty and those people who organize this function that we must have women on stage.
You're a brave man, Gurcharan. Well done.
Thanks for representing. But to sort of go back to that, what you just said, actually, I think that the reason why I don't think of Amar simply as a patriarch, because he's much more complex than that. He's so vulnerable in so many places. And also, as you say towards the end of the book, he's a man of his time. And I think we must read the novel like that, because you speak about India in such a time-sensitive manner during the book.
Right.
That's what makes Amar's position seem so meaningful, rather than merely sort of patriarchal.
Yeah. And this was one of the lessons I also learned in writing this book, that our ancients may have thought about these stages of desire, but actually, in fact, there is some wisdom that desire changes in every decade of our lives. And you've got to read the book I quote here is Tolstoy's novel Family Happiness, but also even in War and Peace, the relationship between Pierre and Natasha. The idea basically of these stages of desire is partly that really, what the ancients were saying was quite different from what the contemporary American husband who comes home one day from work and says, honey, I don't love you anymore. Let's get a divorce tomorrow. Now, that was not the idea of the stages of desire was that you require resources, different resources. You have to understand that desire changes, and therefore your relationship, the caring, the other aspects of desire take over. And that, in a sense, I think the European way, where to some extent, sex is like a tennis game, in the European in the European optimistic tradition, and actually.
In the urban restraint of the Kama
Exactly,
Sutra as well, exactly the same.
For the Nagarika, who is the hero of the Kama Sutra, sex is like a game of tennis.
Light-hearted.
It's light-hearted, and you don't get involved. And so the French have this notion of 5 à 7, 5 to 7. And the idea here is that both of you understand that between 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock, it's consensual, by the way.
You belong to me between 5 and 7, then after that.
Between 5 and 7, we are both free. Like I'm going to go to the club to play a game of tennis or whatever. We can have a pied de terre. But we'll always be home for dinner. We'll always be together with the family over the weekends. But it's those 2 hours, 5 days a week, that's 10 hours a week, is for ourselves. And that keeps the marriage also going. And I guess it comes close to the Nagarika's ideal in the Kama Sutra too. What do you think?
One of the great pleasures of the book is that it is written in the voice of an older man. There's a sort of a gentleness, there's a sense of regret, but there's also a sense of plenitude. This has been a rich life, a full life, and I've been lucky to have it. And one of the reasons I've been lucky to have it is because I have experienced love in so many ways. And I personally am always, of course, karma means desire. We know that. We've been told that, ever since the word came to be. But, when you mentioned Rig Veda in the beginning, and we know that in one of the creation stories in Rig Veda is that the first thing that was born was desire. And I've always wondered whether that was sexual desire or it was desire more in the Buddhist sense of I want,
Or it was something cosmic.
Yeah.
As Freud thought of it also, as a cosmic force, as an emotional orientation to the world. And the interesting thing is, how did this cosmic force of the Rig Veda turn into an intimate love relationship?
The two-person love.
And the two-person love. Yeah. And I think the connecting word is tapas, the Sanskrit word tapas, meaning the heat. The cosmos is created from the heat. The yogi who meditates, Shiva, the heat that he generates is tapasya. And of course the semen rises upwards rather than going downwards. And the sexual act entails a lot of heat. So all three, the word tapas may well connect the cosmic and the intimate.
Well, to chime in about how cosmic love becomes dyadic love of two people, I think it begins, as your book does, in the mother-infant relationship, where the cosmic love is sort of distilled into a two-person universe, and then the rest of it is all smara. We're trying to get it back, trying to get back that ineffable feeling that we once had.
Yeah. And of course, human beings, one difference between human beings and animals is that human beings have the power of imagination. So we may feel that desire, but very quickly that desire gets fixated on one individual, and then our fantasy takes over. And we create this fantasy around that one person. So that cosmic desire suddenly in human beings becomes romantic love.
Well, maybe the life stage
Yeah.
idea is nice there, where you know, sometimes you direct it towards other people, and then other times you experience it more as a cosmic bliss. Hopefully, you're very flexible and can do both.
Okay, everybody's been very patient, so if you would like to a question or a comment or a compliment, raise your hand and a microphone will come to you. Please keep your questions as focused as you can. I'm going to need more light if I have
Can
to
we
identify.
have the little more light in the audience? Great. And before anybody asks a question, I just want to pay you a compliment.
Oh, how lovely, thank you.
And that is, I want to tell everybody, you know, you were just reminding me about why you found a certain plenitude in this book. And I thought Arshia wrote the nicest review about this book. Maybe that's why she's here. But I tell, there's a magazine called Open, Google Open, and it's called Infinite. The title is forget
Infinite
the title.
Splendors.
Infinite
Something
Pleasures.
along those lines.
Anyway, forget that. It's Open, Kama, the Riddle of Desire, and put Arshia Sattar, or you put my name. It is a beautiful review.
Thank you, Gurcharan.
Thank you.
There is a question.
Good evening. This was a very enlightening discussion. My question is in the backdrop of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. I mean,
Sorry?
the Brett Kavanaugh hearings in
The Brett Kavanaugh
yeah,
hearing.
the confirmation.
The Supreme Court
Right.
judge.
So, what do you think is the role of power? I mean, you gave the example of Ahilya, and you know how she wanted to sleep with Indra just because he's the god of gods. So, you know, what's the opposite, where your power messes up your sense of desire? So, what do you think is the
Yeah.
relationship between power and karma?
Thank you that we talked about Me Too and everything, and none of us used the word power. So
That's
go.
what it's all
Wonderful
about.
addition. I think power gives support to lust. And so, but if you're thinking about Eros as having two streams, the lust stream and the affectionate stream, power is the excuse or the looseness. It gives a certain looseness to lust. And so one has to be much more affectionate if one is sitting in a seat of power. Otherwise, the lust stream goes unchecked.
And that's what patriarchy is really all about. And we don't have a monopoly of it in India. Every society in the world suffers from it. Only good news is that the 20th century has been really a century of great progress, I think. The best century for women. I mean, it may be the worst century because we had the worst wars in the world. But at least I feel that women's position in the world, I mean, you should respond to this, Amrita, but I really feel that various revolutions that have come, the various stages of feminism that have taken place, and now the Me Too is being the latest in that phase, that I think that, I mean, to just imagine in 1915, if a woman had a child out of wedlock, she was sent to a lunatic asylum in London. That was the law.
You know, I have to say this one thing about the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. 25 years ago, Anita Hill made the same kind of accusations, allegations against Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas was confirmed. He's sitting in the Supreme Court even now. 25 years later, we're seeing exactly the same thing. You know, it's not been such a great century for women. Well, let's say the latter part of the, I think precisely because women gained as much as they did, that there's a huge backlash.
Yeah.
Well, patriarchs don't want to share their power.
The pill, the jobs, the opportunities, I mean, so much.
The orgasm, the recognition of the female orgasm.
Sexual revolution. But the distribution of power in the economic realm, which I think is what the question is somewhat addressing, political and economic power, is still so heavily skewed in favor of men.
So we have a long way to go.
Another question, yes? Hard road to travel. All men are asking questions. What is this? Yeah.
Namaste to everybody. This is Rakesh. Actually, this is a curiosity I want to share with you, especially the author. As Mr. Gurcharan Das said, the book is written from the male's perspective. My curiosity is about what the lady is going through in her thoughts, the lady in the Deccan Queen. If it is written there, I'm looking forward to read. If not, well, maybe somebody can chip in. Thank you.
Well, my dear fellow, there are a number of women right through, you know, the woman he marries, the woman in the Deccan Queen, whose name, by the way, is Amaya. And then there's another woman when he is an adolescent, Isha, who is the one that interests Amrita the most. I think you'll have to read the book, my dear fellow.
The answer is in the book.
Is there a question from a lady? That would be really nice, yeah.
Okay, so when we look at sexuality, and there's such a
Thank you.
large, the whole spectrum of it, and I feel like asexuality is kind of discussed from the Western lens a lot, but not so much, maybe I haven't read enough about this, but from the Indian lens, and I don't know if you could shed some light on that.
Asexuality in the Indian lens, not me.
Well, you know, I mean, in a sense, this book is really trying to mine the classical sources of sexuality.
But does it find anything in the asexuality realm, in someone who's asexual, right? If I'm understanding the question correctly.
I didn't understand the question.
Asexuality, I'm not familiar with...
There's a lot of transgender.
Yes, but that's still sexuality, however.
Yeah, so I don't know much about.
Great question,
about
though.
that. But what I did, what I thought I heard was that actually, you know, in the judgment on, it was a brilliant judgment that these 5 judges gave on same-sex, including Justice Narayanan. But they all quoted Western thinkers. And what I have tried to do is to bring out the richness that they should have read this book before they gave the judgment, because they would have found at
least a few quotations would have been made.
Some very powerful quotations about just the liberalism in our tradition. I mean, in the Mahabharata, there is this young man, Shwetaketu, who sees his mother going out with a man, a different man every night. So he doesn't like it.
He doesn't cope very well, no.
And so he looks at his father the second night. His father seems all right. The third night, he gets very irritated and he asks his father, "There's something wrong. Doesn't it bother you that your wife is going out with another man every night and coming back in the morning?" And his father says, "No, this is how human beings are. We are polygamous." And what the Mahabharata is basically saying is that actually this monogamy is a more recent imposition, cultural imposition. There was no, I mean, this is like spontaneous order almost in a way, because, I mean, the market, morality, these, no human being created these, internet, these are all spontaneous orders. And so the change from polygamy, which was the natural state, not only says the Mahabharata, but also evolutionary biology seems to suggest that. And certainly after the agricultural revolution, it became very common that this change that took place everywhere.
Well, considering Svetaketu was looking at his mother and sort of getting really upset that his mother is going out with different women, it seems that the change that took place was more about marriage being for children. And as you say, we continue to have a culture that also very much lyricizes adultery in the form of the Geet Govinda, which gets reproduced all over the country in different translations. So perhaps that was just a way of saying we need the outer form of marriage in order to protect the children and family.
Yeah. But the central event of the Mahabharata is polyandry. It's a woman with 5 husbands, So there's something else is going on there as well. Other questions? Another woman, please.
Oh, yeah. Another lady, yes.
What you... Hi, Gurcharan.
Oh, he's going away. No.
No.
Okay.
What you all are talking about now, it arises in my mind that in Sanskrit there's a word called vasanas. Now these vasanas are subconscious hidden desires that until you fulfill all your vasanas, you will continue desiring. And some say it comes from a past life. That I don't know.
There's that beautiful verse in Shakuntala, no? When he's forgotten, but he remembers that he's forgotten something. And the woman is singing to him, Dushanta, to wake him up in the morning. And he says, Vasanas, they linger like fragrance on my scarred soul or something. It's an amazing, amazing verse. But that's a different kind of desire, right?
And that's the kama pessimism in a way. Because these vasanas, you are supposed to get rid of all these desires so that you're not reborn again.
You can't exhaust them, you can't actually fulfill them, work them through.
Okay, yes, but...
the gentleman in the hat.
Very good evening to the enlightened panel. The classic conflict between dharma and kama, you said, has been epitomized as a compromise between KP and KO, optimism and pessimism, but which got channelized into the institution of marriage. But please excuse me for my vulgarity when Mahatma Gandhi said that marriage is institutionalized prostitution. And now we see some changes in the system going on, live-in relationships getting outdated. So where is the equilibrium between kama and dharma in the modern context?
Well, I think this unfortunate statement that you quoted from Mahatma Gandhi is, he got it from Tolstoy. He did not get it from Indian tradition. Tolstoy had a very negative influence. Tolstoy really treated his wife very badly. And if you want to read the worst kind of story about this, is a story that Tolstoy wrote called the Kreutzer Sonata. And the music aficionados amongst you will know that that's a very famous Beethoven violin and piano sonata in which a man and a woman play this sonata, and the husband is jealous. There's nothing going on between them, but he goes and kills his wife. And eventually Tolstoy wrote an apology and in which he basically said that celibacy is the right way to be. And that the book was banned after that. because the Tsar, Russian Tsar, decided that there'd be no next generation if there would be celibacy. So,
Okay, it's 8 o'clock, so we'll take one last question. Is there the gentleman here
The
with
lady
his...
here.
Yeah. Oh, there's a lady.
Let's have both. No?
Okay, let's do both. Let's do the gentleman first, since you're right there. And then the last question will go to the young lady in the black. Yeah.
You mentioned polyandry in Mahabharata. I'm just wondering, Draupadi got Arjun and the Swayamvar. What must be her feelings when, under orders from Kunti, she had to spend the first night with Yudhishthira?
I can only imagine that she was really, really unhappy at that moment. And, not just that moment. I mean, for the rest of her life, she has 5 husbands. She doesn't like a couple of them for sure. And she still, has to spend a year with them. And yeah.
There's a very nice book on this subject, actually, that answers your question. It's called Yajñaseni, and it's written by an Orissa, Pratibha Rai. And she explores, actually, how Draupadi feels about having to be with Yudhishthira. And there's some lyrical passages in which she talks about how she wishes it was Arjuna, but at the same time, she must also be there for Yudhishthira. It's very nice. You'll enjoy it.
And there's also Palace of Illusions by Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni. The young lady, and then we will end the evening.
My question is about, since there's been monogamy in India compared to Western traditions, it seems to me that there's a larger age gap in the man and the woman in relationships, as we see in Indian culture. Can you throw some light on how karma has an influence, especially about the 5 flowers and the stages that you spoke about in the book, with some reflection on what Kama Sutra maybe talks about?
Right.
And do you think that has influenced Indian male-female relations because of a wider age gap as opposed to the more liberal New Age where women are standing up much more for themselves?
Again, the problem is with Manu. Manu Smriti says that you really can't trust a woman. And so Manu says that you better, as soon as she gets her puberty, her first cycle, you better get her married. And so it actually begins right there, that brain washing begins right there. And I remember, in fact, that my father used to say to my mother that the ideal difference, and I had a girlfriend and they were discussing, and the girl happened to be a little older than me. And my father said that the ideal difference in age should be 9 years. Have you heard that? 9 years.
Yeah, in the South, it's a big thing.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Sorry, would you like to say that?
Just that the age difference, to chime in on that, the age difference is more about serving the man and the needs of patriarchy with a nice younger woman that could last a long time.
Good, thank you both very, very much. I've had a delightful evening, so I imagine everybody else has had one too. There are many, many, many good reasons to buy this book. One of them is that you can get it signed right now. So please buy the book, enjoy the book. It's full of wonderful, wonderful stories, very wonderful insights. And, when I was reading it, I was struck yet again in the Dharma book and in how much you know and how beautifully you filter that and make it relevant to whatever it is that you want to say. And I was particularly struck that in the Mahabharata, that book of violence and war, you have found the most exquisite quote about love, which is at the heart of karma. There is always melancholy. Right. And I was like, wow, if he can find that, I would buy the book just to read that.
So that's the answer to this conflict between karma and dharma is in the Mahabharata, that the human condition is this condition, there's no answer. There are some conflicts in which there is no answer. So this is one of those. And that's the melancholic human condition.
Thank you both very much. Thank you all. And please buy the books and get them signed while Gurcharan is